So now that we're a little bit more familiar with the user interface and some of the really base concepts of NodeBox, we can dive a little bit deeper and uncover kind of why this is such a powerful piece of software that we could use for data visualization. So the next step in doing this is really understanding the nature of how NodeBox handles iteration and lists of values. So let's start off easy. This is really just where we started at with our our beginning of our project, right? So I can navigate in here. Everybody opens up NodeBox and gets this project. So we've got our single rectangle from before. Maybe I can give it rounded corners again. See something interesting here, right? So maybe I make it, I don't know, let's make it about 200 wide, right? All right, so here's probably one of the harder concepts to really grasp about NodeBox, and it really took me a while to really understand this properly. NodeBox makes it incredibly easy for you to handle. It makes it incredibly easy for you to handle what we call a list or an array of values. So, we're used to maybe looking at, for example, if I wanted to go in here and I wanted to add a single number in, I can go ahead to my new NodeBox by double-clicking in here, and I can pull down just a single number, right? We're familiar with this. I can type in, for example, I can type in 200 into my value box, right? And just to make things fair, I'm just going to go back to this, and I'm going to make this 100, right, by default, in my rectangle, right? So there it is, my rectangle. It's back to being a square. But I have this number here, right? And the number is 200. I can type in a number, I can input a number, I can output a number. But what if I output that number and I connect it to, for example, the width input on the rectangle? Watch. Okay, so I'm taking this number and I'm inserting it here where the width should be. So I'm modifying this one rectangle here, right? Okay, well that's a fairly simple concept. That's one number that I'm sticking in there to change the shape of this rectangle. Well, what if I stuck an entire list of numbers into this one slot? Logic would say, well, it would overload. It wouldn't know what to do with a whole variety of numbers. Actually, what we can do is if I disconnect that, I can go ahead now and I can create a list of numbers with this node here, the sample node. Sample is pretty important and it helps you space things out sometimes. But what sample is really good for is it allows you to say, okay, I'm going to sample 10 numbers and they're going to be between 0 and 100. That's how it comes by default. So say maybe I want to do 20. I want to sample 20 numbers and I want them to be between 0 and 500. If I double click on this, I can actually view that data as a list, as you've most likely noticed. I can look at that data over here on my left just as the raw data. It outputs a list of numbers. Well, what's going to happen if I plug that into this here? That's only going to take in one number. You'll be surprised at what happens. Let me click and drag this and take the output of this sample list, which is a collection of numbers, right, that I've automatically generated, and I connect it to the width of this rectangle. All right, so it's connected. It didn't complain at me yet. That's a good thing. But what if I double click? Oh, this is interesting. It hasn't complained yet. However, it looks like it has made the rectangle a little wider. Well, let's investigate this a little bit further. So hold this in the back of your mind. We haven't broken it yet. After we've created this rectangle geometry, we can alter the geometry in different ways. So we can transform it, which I'll talk about here in a second. But another thing that we can do is we can apply color to it. So if I double click here and I find the colorize node, for example, colorize, I can double click that. So I'm saying, okay, I'm going to insert this. I'm going to take this whole bunch of numbers over here. I'm going to insert them into the width property of this one rectangle. Okay, a bit confusing. Don't know where that's going to lead us. And then I'm going to take that geometry and I'm going to colorize that geometry. Okay, so let's go ahead and connect the shape here to the shape here and see what happens. Okay, if I click on this colorize node, I'm rendering it, but I'm also looking at the properties. I can go ahead and I can apply a fill color, right? Okay, fairly straightforward. Well, what if I went ahead and I made this invisible? There's an alpha channel value, which is really, it's another way of saying the transparency value, right? So I can do that with the color picker. I can stick web colors in here. Say I made it invisible fill, but I added a stroke color to it. So say I made it a stroke color of, or stroke width of 2. This is really interesting. What it's done here, since I've turned them all into outlines, what it's done here is it's taken this rectangle, and since it's taken in a collection of numbers, it has actually created a whole bunch of copies of this rectangle with the different inserted values. So that's really the power of NodeBox. It took me a while to really grasp this because it's counterintuitive, but once you really grasp that concept, it's very easy, and you start to appreciate the elegance of that. Okay, so this can be still a fairly challenging concept that you're sticking a bunch of numbers into a single input, and that's okay. If you don't quite get it at the moment, then don't worry. We'll have a couple more examples. What I am going to do, though, is I'm going to disconnect this sample node here, this list of numbers. I'm going to disconnect that from the rectangle. As you can see, we have what we're saying now. If you want to talk through it, is I'm saying, okay, I'm going to make a rectangle, and then I'm going to colorize it with a stroke that's 2 units wide and no fill. And that's what we get. We get our original rectangle with that applied to it, right? So let's go ahead and let's try to do something interesting here. I'm going to go up to my rectangle. I'm going to make this maybe 400 wide, right? And you can see it updates automatically with my colorize. The nice part about this is you can take geometry out of here and you can transform geometry. So apply transformation matrices. So rotate it, scale it, or translate it. That's usually the 3 ways that we transform things. So I can go ahead and I can take this geometry out and I can go ahead and, for example, I'll get a really interesting effect maybe if I rotate this. So let me go ahead and grab this rotate node. We notice it takes in geometry. This outputs geometry. Let's put colorize aside for just a minute and connect this to rotate. Okay, so nothing new. And let me clean this up just a little bit, keep this off to the side. Okay, so I've got my rectangle here, right? And then I've got the rotate node. Well, we're not rotating at any angles yet, but I can certainly adjust this number and you'll see I've applied that transformation. So here's our original rectangle. And then further on down the pipe, you'll see, once I double click on that, this is the rectangle with this rotation applied to it. Okay, this is really simple, right? We get the concept. What do you think will happen if I put the list of numbers into the angle input? Well, let's go ahead and try it and see what happens. Okay. Interestingly enough, we have, oops, I'm sorry, that was the number. Sorry. Mistake. Let's take these samples. Yeah, there we go. There's our list of numbers. Okay. Interesting. This is more like it, right? Well, what has it done? It's actually made like we've done with the rectangle up here. We've taken the sample now and we've made a copy of each one that we've rotated, right? So there's a couple ways to skin a cat. We did the copy node in the last exercise, right? And you were able to see that. But also you can certainly do all kinds of interesting arrays and transforms by working with these transformation nodes, such as the rotate node. So what happens when I take this geometry now and I colorize it and I double click it? Oh, interesting. We're starting to get a fairly interesting pattern here. So it's interesting because now that we've set up this, a pipeline, so to speak, that I'm saying, okay, take this rectangle, rotate it for each one of these values, rotate a copy, and then colorize it to be transparent and have this stroke. It's interesting now because now we really have a lot of parameters that we can tweak to get some interesting effects. So say maybe I tweak the height of this, right? And I tweak the width of it, right? I bring the width in and the height more. You start seeing some really interesting sort of stuff. A lot of which is probably, I would guess, unintended consequences of kind of playing with this. I'm going to take the sample here and I'm going to take the endpoint of it, for example, and kind of start playing with that. So this is certainly, you can see how you can start getting some interesting levels of complexity here. Just from tweaking just a few things, right? I can even reduce the number of samples, right? So there are different things that you can just click through here and tweak. And sometimes this is a really enjoyable process in and of itself of just intuitively just tweaking until you see something of interest. So go ahead and play with that. Go ahead and try to pull down a transform node, but also create a sample list. So go ahead, you can double click again. You get it from here if you type in sample. Go ahead and grab sample and start working with maybe a list of values and see what kind of interesting stuff you get when you start stacking this. Also, play around with colorizing your geometry. So pass this stuff through the colorize node and start working with that as well. There's endless possibilities. Maybe you can try connecting sample into a color node that you connect in the colorize. So there's all different things that we can play with here, and just go ahead and experiment with it yourself, and then we'll move on to the next exercise.